How many of you wore your ugly sweaters tonight? Nobody. They're all beautiful sweaters. First thing we're going to do is we're going to move this out of the way. Everybody happy to be out and about? Yeah. I'm so happy to be here doing this. It's been a long time, and my favorite place to do a presentation is right here with this organization. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming. And let's get started. I've got a lot to cover. I already regret picking this topic because it confuses me. But how many people are aware of, have passed a million times the Potter Memorial, the mansion? Pretty familiar stuff, right? I learned an awful lot about the Potters in putting this together, and I want to share some of that with you. I think if you're anything like me, you probably really don't know too much about the individuals in the family. I know I didn't, and now I know more, and it's pretty interesting. If we can knock the light down just a bit, thank you. And let's get started. The flowing of money here is part of the topic because part of the Potter's story is about money and where it came from and where it went, but it's also about the people too. So I want you to learn more about the people. And so I have three generations really that we're going to talk about. The generation of Henry S. Potter, Alfred Potter, his son, and then Fred Potter. And Fred is the one that most would associate with the mansion at 53 West Church Street. If we go out a little broader, Henry up at the top, he's born 1798 and died in 1884, and his wife Harriet Benedict Potter, 1805 to 1881. If that name Benedict might sound familiar, I suspect that is very much ingrained with the Pittsford and Perinton Benedict family. You may know there's a Benedict Road, likely the same family. And then on this line, the children and the wife of Henry are listed here, and the reason I put them here, they were the major recipients of the estate of Henry, except that his wife passed away first. So we can cross her off. We have 5 children, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened with that fortune, where it came from, and kind of interesting stories behind it. Alfred, the father, as I said, of Fred, and they're the ones that came to our community. That's the connection to Fairport and Perinton. Alfred was born in 1833, died in 1896, and his son, Fred, born in 1870, and 1943 is when he passed away. That is what triggered the will of Fred Potter that led to the donation of his estate and home to the village of Fairport. Fred also had 2 sisters. By the way, I guarantee you, this will be the most boring slide. 2 sisters, Alice Potter Howard and Bertha Potter Rusling. Each of them passed away in 1935. Notable, none of them had children. So no grandchildren for Alfred and his wife, and among this part of the family tree, there was not another generation to pass along the money to. That number 20 indicates that I researched 20 different members of the Potter family, and these are the folders from my computer, jam-packed with confusing, conflicting, interesting information that is now part of our archives. Interesting that in this museum, the information that we had on the Potter family is not so significant. And so a lot of this was new research, new information. The most tangible thing that we have from the Potter family is this bicycle. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Fred Thayer Potter. Thayer was his mother's maiden name. The Thayer family lived in Lakeside, Wayne County, right along Lake Ontario. If you're familiar, there's still a place called Lakeside near Ontario along the lake. And that's where her pretty substantially financed family was from. Fred, as I said, born in 1870, died in 1943, and was never married. And here is a close-up of him from a photograph that you will see the total view of shortly. His father, Alfred, and wife, Hulda Thayer Potter. And here's a nice picture of Alfred B Potter. Here is Henry Sayre Potter, Fred's grandfather, and his wife, Harriet Benedict Potter. Thank you, Vicki, for providing a photograph that you found at the last minute, because I always hate when all we talk about and show is the men. Unfortunately, sometimes we're kind of handcuffed because that is what we have, and that is what was more prevalently talked about way back when.
He doesn't look very happy.
From what I've seen, they are at their happiest here. Please don't strike me down. Here's a historic marker from 1932 from outside Seneca Falls, and it commemorates the Potter Inn and Farm owned by Nathaniel Jay Potter, an innkeeper, who was Henry's father. And so he owned this inn, and it says on this 1932 marker, which is still in existence, that his son, Henry S., lived here and was the first president of the Western Union Telegraph Company. There's the clue as to where the money came from. Yes, he lived, Henry did, in the Seneca Falls area up until the age of about 10. But, you know, we like to claim those folks that are our hometown folks. In the 1934 edition from Sunday, July 29th of the Democrat and Chronicle, it talked about this new historic marker and the information that I just shared, and that they operated an inn from 1801 to 1808. After 1808, Henry's father, Nathaniel, and the family moved to Canandaigua. His dad died just a couple years later in 1810 in Canandaigua. And at that point forward, when Henry was just about a 12-year-old boy, he was the man of the family. He was working as a store clerk in Canandaigua and went about his adult life, essentially at the age of 12 or 13. July 4th, 1776, kind of a big date in American history. Also a big date in Potter history, because that was the birth date of Nathaniel Jay Potter, Henry's dad. Here is what you may find to be a familiar home. This was the home of Henry Potter in Pittsford. Still stands today. After he left Canandaigua, where he was a teenager as a shopkeeper, he went a variety of places, including Williamson, where he worked in stores as a merchant's helper and so forth. Eventually, he made his way to Pittsford pretty early, and this was his home. Here is evidence of his early presence in Pittsford. From January of 1824, a donation from Henry Potter of $6 to the Greek Fund of Monroe County. I have no idea why he was captivated by the Greek Fund, but this does tell us that he was present by that early, 1824. Now, he was only about 26 years old at that time. This photograph is probably, I'm guessing, from the 30s or 40s. There's electrical wires that are going by. There's concrete sidewalks, things that you look at to try to get some understanding of dates. If I pulled back the photo and you could see the rest of it, there was a combination of pavement and a brick street. Here's the photo of this house from more recently. I'll go back for a moment so you can see. It happens to be that the photo that I came up with is exactly the same angle and very well preserved, sold recently, and just a beautiful house. It is on Monroe Avenue at number 20, so just west of that Four Corners area of Pittsford, by the famous Little House in Pittsford. 1846, the Buffalo Morning Express reported on an audacious burglary. So now we're just working our way, tracing some data points in time. 1846, I love how they wrote stories back then. It wasn't just a burglary, it was an audacious burglary. The store of Henry S. Potter, Esquire. How do you get to be an Esquire? He's not a lawyer. In the village of Pittsford was broken open on Wednesday night, the 15th, and robbed of $400 or $500 in 1846. That's about $17,000 in today's money that he kept in a vault in the store. Having effected an entrance, they descended and sawed upon the door at the foot of the stair, which was barred, by means of strong iron bars with which they guided themselves. They brought a bar. They forced the thing open. They forced the vault open, breaking the bolts, and then in like manner opened the safe in the vault where the money was deposited. No clue to this bold robbery had been found at the date of our information from the Rochester American newspaper picked up in Buffalo. This map of Pittsford is provided here so I can take a shot at showing you about where the store was, right about here. Here's Monroe Avenue. His home would be right about here. And then as you're heading towards the canal, where Shane Place would be right here. His store was right here on this corner. A few years later, here's the 1850 census of Pittsford. Here's Henry Potter. His real estate is valued at $31,000. Sometimes census information is bad. His profession is listed as none. And he certainly was a busy man all throughout his life. Lists Harriet, Charles, Mary, his children, Alfred, who is Fred's father, a couple more sisters, and a servant, Sarah Wood, Pittsford, 1850. Now the location of the store, here is a bigger version of that map that I showed you. Here is that corner, here's the canal going by, and this is what's there if you recognize this place today. I wish we had a photo from long, long ago so we could see the business, but he was a merchant. I'm believing that he was kind of a general merchandise type of operator, but he did a lot more than that. But he was prosperous in Pittsford. So prosperous that he went where rich people did. He went to Rochester and bought a beautiful home in the Cornhill neighborhood, the 3rd Ward, which was certainly the place to be in the mid-19th century. 133 South Fitzhugh Street. That is a photo I just took while there were still leaves on the trees, so pretty recently. Beautiful home. This is reflecting back. This is from 1879. It is an essay about the Western Union Telegraph Company. And reflecting back, it gives us a feel for how Henry became affiliated with the telegraph business as an investment opportunity. And it goes on to say, to secure funds, the holders of the patent interest, the folks that had these patents for telegraph technology, acquired a large issue of stock, very wisely determined to part with a liberal amount of their interest to induce subscribers to pay up in full. It goes on to say that Henry S. Potter, a rich, active, stirring citizen, had subscribed $10,000. To him, an additional $10,000 of stock, $20,000 in all, was issued. After that happened, he became president. This was a very adroit action. A very adroit action. I said to myself, what does that mean? Adroit, clever, or skillful in using the hands or mind. So it was a very adroit action, obviously. Mr. Potter entered his duties with much zeal. Didn't have to look that one up. 1851, April 4th, from the Buffalo Daily Report, Republic lists Henry S. Potter as the president of the company. And the company initially was known as the New York and Mississippi Valley Printing Telegraph Company. That was the foundation of what became Western Union. Here's a receipt from the New York and Mississippi Valley right here. So we get some feel for a document and what it would look like in that mid-50s era. Henry was in on the ground floor. Several Rochesterians were in on the ground floor. including names like Sibley and Watts and others. So amazing that in this community in Rochester and our area, very few people really recognize that the formation of Western Union, a real kind of a Google of its day, kind of an Amazon of its day, started right here in Rochester. And our Henry Potter was behind it. 1852, gosh, right after that audacious burglary in Pittsford, they followed him to Rochester. 2 robberies and an arrest. And they talk about robberies in that 3rd ward of both Isaac Hills and Henry S. Potter, Esquire, were robbed of valuable jewelry and money to the amount of several $100s in all. In the course of a very short time and before the perpetrator was caught, and a large portion of the articles found upon him. Good news. This is an early map of that 3rd ward area, and here we see the estate of Henry S. Potter, and here's one of his daughters, Henrietta Potter, on these maps. Start to quantify where these people were, and it's nice to see a name on a map, on a document sometimes, just to give some credence to what we're reading. Now, I'm going to use the word meanwhile occasionally. I struggled to try to figure out how to tell this story. Multiple generations overlapping. Do I tell the whole story of Henry and then go back and tell Alfred and then go back and tell Fred? Or do I try to mush them together? I've chosen mush, which means I'm going to say the word meanwhile once in a while. Meanwhile, Alfred and Huldah. In the 1869 directory of Monroe County, Alfred B. Potter is listed as living in Adams Basin on a farm of 157 acres. Again, 1869. Let's go back. When was he born? 1833. So what's that? 36-year-old man. Here is a map of the village of Adams Basin. It does not show them on the map, and this is a period map, maybe a year after they left, but they may have been more in the outskirts rather than the village because they had 157 acres. Here's the 1870 census report of the town of Sweden, which would take in that area, including Adams Basin. We're talking about the area generally between Brockport and Spencerport, along the Erie Canal. And here on this page, Alfred Potter, 37 years old, retired farmer. Raise your hand if you did retire by the age of 37. There may be a connection to Western Union and the retirement of this young man. Huldah, his wife at this point, is 25 years old, 12 years his junior, and they have one child, Alice, the oldest of the 3 children, here in the town of Sweden, post office of Brockport. Here's a map of Fairport in 1872, 2 years after the census. West Church Street, Main Street. Here is the Potter property, listed on the 1872 map. A. B. Potter, Alfred B. Potter. There's the house. One of the first pieces of evidence that we have that they were actually in Fairport by 1872. Aren't these maps great? Because they give us so much information, and we can date things with them. By the way, we live near the canal, right? You know what else was near the canal? Adams Basin. You know what else is near the canal? The 3rd Ward. You know what else is near the canal? Pittsford. Catherine Angevine, previous president and human dynamo who accomplished so much here, emailed me a couple of weeks ago and said, Bill, why did the Potters move to Fairport? And I thought, I've been studying this for months, and I don't know the answer. But it caused me to think about it. It's amazing how one simple question can get you to look at things. And one thing I did come to realize is all those 4 places I just listed, Pittsford, 3rd Ward, Adams Basin, Fairport, the residences in each of those communities were very, very close to the canal. If nothing else, it could have been familiarity. Now, here's the Monroe County map that is on that wall, the real 1858 map of Monroe County, and I use this just to show you that they moved 25 miles as the crow flies from Adams Basin on the canal to Fairport. And this Potter property, as illustrated in the 1885 bird's eye view of Fairport, gives you a feel for what that property looked like 14 years after Alfred and his wife moved to Fairport. You had the house, barns, and mostly a lot of open land, leading back to Hulbert Road, the Oxbow along the canal. It's another data point. This wonderful lithograph is from the 1877 History of Monroe County. Big important book that we have. We even have reprint copies of it for sale up in the gift shop. And in this book is a little biography of Alfred Potter, and this wonderful image, really the best image of what the Potter mansion looked like at one time. Here's a close-up of that image. And so you can see that it is of Italianate architecture with the cupola and the wide brackets and eaves, and you can get a glimpse of the carriage house over here and this beautiful fence out front. This is what the Potter place looked like in 1878, did I say? And you have the 1885 bird's eye view, but also it probably looked like this, very similar to this, from its earliest years. We know it doesn't look so much like this now, right? We'll do a comparison. Digging into Alfred, who I knew virtually nothing about, I learned that he was an involved citizen in this community. It's easier to be an involved citizen when you don't have a job. Having said that, I admire his service. 1873, Alfred was elected to the village board. He was a trustee on our village board shortly after moving here. And here every year they would call it the charter election, and they list his name as a newly elected trustee. This little newspaper item relates a bit to our friend Alfred and talks about the new lockup, the jail. The new lockup is beginning to assume shape and comeliness. Everything you want in a lockup. Although small, we hope it is, get this, pay attention to this sentence. Although the lockup is small, we hope it is large enough to accommodate all disorderly characters our village can produce in the next 20 years. It's almost like we're striving for a big crop of violators. At the Board of Trustees meeting from September 1st, the village board met at the lockup. They held their meeting there. So they were proud of this new lockup. Where was this new lockup? You've seen this building being worked on? And I was just asked about this evening. What on earth is going on there? Thank goodness we have property owners and business people and folks in this community that are finding ways to spend their money, taking a great old building and refurbishing it, rehabilitating it, doing everything but tearing it down, and we'll have a newly functional, hopefully thriving business there. This is almost at the corner of Liftbridge Lane and North Main Street. The parking lot that's right here, Liftbridge Lane is right here, North Main, Ricky's, open today! Didn't they? So what used to be on this corner? The Cottage Hotel. And the Cottage Hotel had a terrible fire and burned and was eventually torn down about 1970 or so. But before that, that's where the lockup was. Really went off on a tangent there, didn't we? Now, not only was Alfred Potter on the village board, he was also on the Board of Education for Fairport's new Union School, located on West Church Street, where the school administration building is, the Strepa building. Before the Strepa building was built, they tore this building down. It was Fairport's first high school, built about 1872. And right after that, Alfred was on the board, A B Potter. I thought until recently that Tim Sliz, who for a period of time was just holding a position on the school board and the village board, I thought that must be a first. Nope. Look at this crowd out front of this building. Anybody go to this school? And it's not a joke, right? It was torn down in the late 50s. Good.
Second grade, and we were not allowed on the second floor because it was
Too scary?
scary.
Yeah. One of the things I always heard about this building is it turns out the way buildings were designed long, long ago, while beautiful, were not necessarily safe. And the way this building was designed with the furnace power plant underneath the stairway, which went right up the center of the building, if the place ever caught fire, it would go up in a heartbeat. That, and they let it go to such a degree that it wound up being torn down. 1873, August 8th, local affairs. Now we have our public-minded servant, Alfred Potter, along with J.Y. Parse, who were victims of a villainous act. I'm going to start using words like this in the histogram to catch your eye, because I'm learning that the first two words should be villainous or atrocious. A villainous act, some cowardly scoundrel, out of a spirit of mere devilishness. Good luck finding a neutral jury. Besmirched the front fences of J.Y. Parse and A.B. Potter. And here's the Parse house, still stands on the corner of, very close to the corner of Parse Avenue and North Main Street, and Mr. Potter. And what did these folks and these families have in common? They were very passionate about the cause of temperance and human rights of the day, and not big fans of alcohol. So their fences were vandalized. Black paint thrown upon their fences. Never did find where the bad persons were caught.
No use for the lockup.
Those two apparently, they didn't make it to the lockup. Now, Alfred and Hulda Perrin, there are many references in our newspapers to the cause of temperance, and many examples where the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, met at the Potter home, 53 West Church Street. Events were held there, big events, hundreds of people in attendance, where they talked about their issues and tried to gain momentum for the important issues in their life. Who's Susan B. Anthony. And this is Fairport's Methodist Church. Just around the corner from the Potter home. Very close. Susan B. Anthony came to the Methodist Church in July of 1894 in Fairport. Given the very active nature of the Potter family in the Methodist Church in Fairport, I would certainly not be surprised if the Potters helped make that happen, bringing Susan B. Anthony to the church, 1894. This is me. It's not the same shirt. It often is when I see a photo. The reason I'm here is to give you some sense of scale, because this is one of those times when I'm going to say, meanwhile, what was Henry Potter doing? Well, in 1875, he was creating an enormous monument to commemorate his eventual, after his death, his life and the life of his wife. And so in April of 1875, the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle went on to say, a number of unusually fine and costly monuments are to be erected this spring, including the most costly monument, nearly completed And all of this goes on to talk about this enormous monument to Henry S. Potter. And then, interesting that this is what we chose to chisel. And Harriet Benedict, many times today, it might say wife of. It doesn't even typically say wife of. But here we said, Harriet Benedict, wife of Henry S. Potter all over again. Oh, to have your own identity. These two ladies up here are known as Hope and Sorrow. And I point out that hope is consoling sorrow, except I think it should be the other way around, because Hope is the one that lost her head, I think. These in the article are described as being 6 feet tall. So you're really not getting quite a sense of the size of this. This is in Mount Hope Cemetery, by the way, and this entire area is Potter stones. And this big centerpiece stone of Henry and his wife, in today's money, would be $150,000. Many, many nice pairs of shoes. It even has a likeness of himself, as you can see. Now, this was created several years before his wife's death, but not. Meanwhile, I'm kind of picking on Henry a little bit, but he did a really great thing. He donated a lot of money to the Rochester Orphan Asylum. I talked about the Lockup and how they really seemed to be hoping that they'd get a lot of criminals to fill it up. Along the same vein, when the Rochester Orphan Asylum was looking forward to the new and commodious building, a wing that was being funded by Henry Potter, they said, "The greatly increasing the facilities for accommodating the many friends of this institution, and it is hoped it will be then filled to overflowing." Do you really want it overflowing with orphans? Is that really what we're after? 1882, a Potter Memorial Building erected through the generosity of Henry Potter, forming the west wing of the orphan asylum in Hubble Park, Rochester, was dedicated on Thursday. Hubble Park is also in the Cornhill area. I have tried to draw a link between the street, the little street of Hubble Park, and Walter Hubble. Walter Hubble was a very noteworthy attorney who was George Eastman's attorney for decades, a very wealthy man who married into a very wealthy family, the DeLand family of Fairport. Leora DeLand, daughter of Daniel and Minerva DeLand, married Walter S. Hubble. I don't know if that's what that street is, but there weren't so many Hubbles around back then. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection. Hubble Park, here's Hubble Park. Potter lived up this way a touch, and here's the orphan asylum. This side over here was the addition funded by our Henry Potter. Here's a photograph of what it looked like. Sadly, Henry passed away in 1884, and it's reported in a relatively brief story on his life in the Democrat and Chronicle. What was not brief is this 10,000-word essay, which is really his will. And back then, especially if you had money, it was imperative that your will in its totality be published in the newspaper. It's just what would happen. The H.S. Potter will, the document presented for probate yesterday. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. 1884. This headline soon hit the paper. A sensational will. Henry S. Potter's post-mortem attack on his son's wife. Casting odium on the refined lady, even from the grave. The will contested as scandalous and void. A lively fight is coming. A lively fight. So there are provisions to the will, endless provisions to the will, two of which I will just briefly touch upon. In this one, the fifth provision talks about the shares, the 1/6 shares of the estate that would go to daughter Mary Hart and daughter Susie McAlpin. Net annual income from the proceeds of the trust. However, if either of these two ladies, if they or either of them shall survive my said grandsons, Henry N. Potter or Reynolds McAlpin, the payment of 1/6 shall cease. So if the mother of this boy outlives her son, she's cut off. If the other grandson dies, or either of them die, both of the daughters, these two daughters of three, are cut off. No real understanding for why that would happen, but does that strike you as odd?
No, it makes them motivated to keep them all alive.
That glass is so half full. I really admire that. I need to be more like you. The second provision that I wanted to highlight, the son, Charles B. Potter, shall not live with or at any time contribute in any manner to the support or maintenance of his present wife. If he does not live with her or at any time or in any way contribute to her support or maintenance, then he will get his share. From what I can tell, Charles' wife had the audacious nerve to have an opinion about financial matters. And that seems to have been enough. The Potter Estate, 1885, this little article starts to break down some information as to what two key players would get. Alfred, for one, father of Fred, and sister Henrietta. But let me first make sure you feel comfortable. Those two first provisions, they were eventually thrown out in probate. Those did not fly. It took a while, and it was a big fight, and it probably sold a lot of newspapers. In the meantime, Alfred Potter, it was determined by 1885, would get $8,000 per year, and his sister Henrietta would get $12,000 per year. I'm not going to pretend to understand all of this. There's an enormous amount of money that we're talking about, and most of it was held in trust, and most of it simply paid dividends off the interest in trust. This story would go on for many, many decades, as you will see. But in the 1880 census, meanwhile, for Alfred in Fairport, here he is. No occupation for Alfred. Didn't need one at this point, for sure. The last evidence we had of him working was so long ago. If you remember, he was a retired farmer. 10 years before this, 11 years before this. So here's his family with Huldah, his wife, Alice, Frederick, and Bertha, the three kids, 10, 9, and 6 years old, in Fairport, 53 West Church Street. I want to point out that in a much later newspaper article related to Alice Potter and her estate from 1935, her father was listed as a banker. And I found several newspaper items that listed Alfred, who was a farmer early on in the town of Sweden out there, as a farmer. He's listed as a banker. And I guess the moral here is sometimes there's just real bad information out there. Now, his father had investments in banks, Henry, but Alfred, there is no evidence he really ever had a job after being on the farm. 1886, and here we are with this is actually the 1902 map of Fairport, West Church Street. Here's the Potter property. We now have Potter Place, the street on the map, and so this predates that map by several years. but it talks about A.B. Potter opening a new road. They're talking about Potter Place. That's when they started to entertain the idea of subdividing, eventually dividing that, maybe generating some income as a result. And eventually, the south end of Potter Place, some folks might live there, was once known as Brooks Avenue, Brooks Hill School, 200 South Main Street, the Brooks home. That's where the Brooks comes from. Eventually, it just all became Potter Place. So they're doing things in Fairport, improving the community, and probably looking for a way to perhaps generate a little income. Maybe because that money that was coming in was just income from the trust, not the actual huge lump sum. 1887, Alfred B Potter will continue improvements on his property and opening of the new street this spring, which is odd because when we look at when the houses were built on Potter, it was years later, years after 1887. That 1902 map I showed you, there's no houses on it yet. Here are the barns that we're talking about. The most northern portion still stands here. This used to ramble back, and if you look at even in this photo, you see the shadow of a roof line. There used to be another barn behind that. What we haven't seen yet, as of 1887, is the changes to the Potter Mansion. We haven't seen any indication of that yet. So it still looks like what I showed you in that lithograph when it's an Italianate structure. A.B. Potter greatly improved his residence. When I saw this, I thought maybe this is it. Maybe this is the evidence of the change in the house. Nope. 1890, A.B. Potter has been making extensive enlargements and improvements to his barns. He was really into horses, and so that's a factor. So that now they are second to none in the vicinity. Mr. Rowell did the work. It's kind of nice to know who built houses and barns. Yes?
I see that says Fairport Herald. What year did that newspaper start?
Our first ones are from 1873. And then you had the Monroe County Mail, and they operated simultaneously, and then that's how we got the Fairport Herald Mail. They took over the mail. Good question. Here is the only photograph that I know of that shows the original Potter house before changes. And if you went back to that lithograph and looked, you'd see this is a dead ringer for it. These are still the front doors. Of course, what's not here is that grand porch across the whole front of the house. This is Fred Potter. And Fred, too, was very much into horses. And trying to date this, Fred was born in 1870. I've wondered, is he 12 years old? It's hard to say, right? But it has always been identified for a long, long time as being Fred Potter. Fred Potter and his sister Bertha, who attended in 1890 the Genesee Wesleyan Cemetery. Maybe they went there too. The seminary in Lima, New York, not far away. There is no evidence that Fred went to Fairport High School across the street from his house. Maybe he did. In the earliest Fairport High School yearbooks, our yearbooks only started in 1926, but they list the graduates from the earliest years. You know, the graduating class of 2, graduating class of 5 people. Oh, a big year, 10, 12. And he is not listed in any of those graduating classes. I also checked, because oftentimes people with more access to money went to the Macedon Academy. Not there either. We have a book filled with the graduates of the Macedon Academy. But we do know that he and his sister Bertha did go to the Wesleyan Seminary. Now, Fred was kind of into sports. I don't know that he played them, but he was into them. And this is an image from 1892 of the Fairport Athletic Club baseball team. I am not sure, but this may be Fred Potter. At this point, I'm being serious. It may be Fred Potter. I've compared images. I've compared things like ears. It may be Fred. So the point is, Fred was very much an enthusiast of baseball. And in fact, you'll see that as time goes on in his life. He was very much a supporter and a financial supporter of baseball in Fairport. 1892, one of the few examples that I have been able to find where Fred is with other young people in the community doing something fun. And in this case, taking the steam launch Angie out with some friends. The Angie was actually a boat that was headquartered out of Newark. And on the canal in that era, going out on a steam launch with friends is something that you would do. And in this case, you see some familiar names, including the Cobb name, the Bound name, Bound Wagon Works. Mulliner is a big name in Fairport. So interesting that Fred did that, but not many mentions of his name in this era. Very few. 1892, Fred's going on a trip. And this was notable. Fred was going on a trip with the Reverend of the Methodist Church in Fairport, Reverend Cowman. And I show you this image to give you an idea. Here's the Methodist Church. And here's Perrin Street. Gee, I cut it off a little early. Right over here would be the Potter house. So everything in their life was so close together. They had First High School right across the street from the house almost. The Methodist Church that they were so involved in. And now Fred, February 1892, planning a trip. This is the passport application for Reverend Cowman, which, what a different world. You know, my office is at the town hall is right next to the clerk's counter. And boy, people come in for their passport, and it's an ordeal, you know, and you better be working on your passport months in advance, especially during these times. Reverend Cowman picked up his passport the day they were leaving the country. Can you imagine? 1892, this story talks about Cowman and Potter taking the steamin' Newland of the Red Star Line from New York on a journey toward Palestine and the Holy Land, that they would be gone about 3 months. This is the ship they took from March to June of 1892. Was not a color photograph, it was a colored photograph, hand-colored photograph. Finally, by 1893, A. B. Potter is making extensive additions to his fine residence, and an additional story is being added to the main part of the building. So here's the before, and here is the after, where they've added these enormous shingled, gambreled with towers and various things that are different now, these pointy roofs. They're not there anymore, but most of it is still there. The big porch. Of course, it will be one of the finest country homes in this section. Big change, right? True confession, I kind of like it like this. Generally, for me, when you have a great old house, the best it ever was is what it was. 1895, it turns out all of that remodeling and changing of that home maybe was for a purpose, because there was a big event in October of 1895, the wedding of Alice Potter. And she's marrying a gentleman, and who is the pastor? But Mr. Cowman, who is now a pastor in Wellsville, but came up to Fairport to officiate. And Alice married Walter Jones Howard. And so she became Alice Howard. I show you this home because shortly after, their address was listed as this place. And this place in the city of Rochester was the home of the first mayor of Rochester. I thought I had the address. It says the address, 37 South Washington Street, Rochester. They didn't live there long. 1896 is the year that our second generation that we're focusing on, Albert Potter, passed away, 1896. And it was really a sense of heartfelt community love that I found in the newspaper articles about his death. He really was a warmly embraced person and recognized for doing a lot of good things. And imagine if someone wrote this about you. The profusion of rare flowers in exquisite designs was particularly noticeable, but not like the fading of their beauty and fragrance will be the memory of the beloved and lamented Christian citizen, Alfred B Potter. Nice thing to say. And his biography was published in 1907 in a history of Monroe County, and he was confirmed here to be very much a beloved and respected person. His family got over his loss by traveling. And his widow and children did some serious traveling. Specifically, Mrs. Potter, Fred, and Bertha, they went south. And when they went places, they went for months, as people often did that had the means to do so. And they spent a lot of time in these southern states and Florida for months at a time, visiting these cities, and had a most enjoyable time, 1897. Meanwhile, the west wing of the orphanage in Rochester had what has been recorded as one of the great tragedies in Rochester when it burned to the ground. And the loss of life was significant. And terrible headlines in the newspaper about the destruction. And you won't find it. I went down that street, and there's certainly no sign of it. By 1909, the Potters were traveling again, and this time, this was an epic trip. I have tried to make some indication with these dots of all the places that they went, all the way down the east coast of Florida. And keep in mind, they had to get to Florida. So they did all that traveling. It's 1909. Probably trains were involved to some degree. Miami, South Beach, Cuba, several spots, basically described as an entire tour of Cuba, and then this entire Bahamas region in 1909. 1906, William Beaton. And William Beaton was the chauffeur for Alfred Potter, Fred's father, and became the chauffeur for Fred as well. So this is William Beaton, and he's almost hard to see, but this is Fred in the back seat. I believe that Fred was also familiar with the back seat of this bicycle, because I would not be surprised if Fred's chauffeur was on the front. I say that because there is no evidence, although Fred was an enormous fan of automobiles and really had the nicest cars and really changed them out. We would read of his latest automobile and going to the automotive shows. There is zero evidence that he ever actually drove one. And on his extensive traveling, he was always with a chauffeur and or companion. This house is right across the street from the Potter Memorial Home. And this house happens to be the home of the young lady who was the recipient of Fred's gift, a bicycle. Now, she was not willed this bicycle. It was given to her before his death. Fred was born in 1870. She's listed here as Mrs. Carl G. Miller. She was born in 1920. Fred died in 1943. For her to be old enough to receive this as a gift from him, I assume it was very late in Fred's life. This was given to the museum decades ago, a gift from her and her husband. It is extraordinarily heavy and has no brakes. And there's no evidence that it ever had any brakes. It would be good to own in a flat community. I hurt myself bringing it out here, but I think it's really cool, and I wanted to show it to you. And this is, again, the most tangible and one of the only things that we have in this museum that are an actual artifact from the Potter family. And it's too early, this photograph. Otherwise, how cool would it be if we saw it leaning up against the porch? Fred Potter was a member of the Fairport Fire Department. I don't know if he ever put out a fire. He may have. Fred's involvement often seems to have been as a very active, passionate supporter, both emotionally and financially. And those are not nothing, right? He had that money and he found a way to support his local community, including the fire department. But he also loved baseball. And in 1916, you see, this is chronological, he went to the World Series. Red Sox against Brooklyn. At a time when Brooklyn was what was the name of the Brooklyn team? The Robins, thank you. The Robins. I didn't know that, but you did. So he went to the World Series with players such as Babe Ruth, Casey Stengel there, 1916. Came home and supported more baseball teams. And again, here's a later image of a Fairport baseball team, and I am pretty certain that really is Fred Potter. Really, in this later photograph. And I'm not kidding, but if you really want to try to compare people, zoom way in and look at ears and noses. Although they both get bigger, they stay the same shape. Fred went to the 1927 Rose Bowl in California and attended a historic game which ended 7-7. And look who the coach was of Stanford, Pop Warner, who then came to Fairport and started a league. That part I made up. So Fred was there, Alabama versus Stanford, 1927. He also went to the Rose Bowl parade. Meanwhile, in 1929, decades after the death of Henry Potter, who created all that wealth for the family, they were still arguing over his estate 45 years later. And now we have a story where a Potter heir, the wife of the Potter heir, where there was a divorce involved, was seeking her claim of the grandson of Potter's share. So confusing. But how about Fred Potter with his 1938 Buick convertible? And it's a good-looking car. And I like cars, and I like to pay attention to cars. And when I saw this, it made me think, if there's any car people out there, of a very important car in General Motors history, the 1938 Buick Y-Job, the very first car credited with being a concept, and its designer, Harley Earl. 1938 Buick concept car, 1938 Buick. I see some similarities. This was a real classy car in its day. Fred Potter with his Buick. Well, just a few years later, Fred passed away in 1943. And he was a well-known man about town. Like his father, there is no evidence that Fred ever needed or had a job. He kept busy supporting a lot of initiatives in the community and traveling with his family and being with friends. But he was respected. And this story goes on to describe him as a congenial man who thoroughly enjoyed his friendships, which were many, and talked about how he shared his money with the community as well. I tried to put some numbers together to understand just what Fred received from the estate. Given I have two big holes here that I've shadowed in yellow, in 1896, the death of his father, in 1925, the death of his mother, I could find no indication of what benefit Fred found financially from the death of his parents. Certainly there was something there. Despite that, Fred received over the years over $500,000, which today would be something in the order of $8 million. And those go all the way back to 1884, his grandfather's will, where each of the grandchildren were remembered. They received $5,600 from income property. Also, the final disposition in 1892 for grandchildren, where he received more money. 1929, when the trust was finally dissolved, he got $200,000 1929. What I don't know is that before or after the crash. 1935, twice his two sisters died, and in one case Fred received $82,000 in trust and the other $268,000. Lots of money today, loads of money then. Democrat and Chronicle announced June 12, 1943, Fairport gets the Potter home and $50,000 in gifts. The legacy maintains for a memorial playground. We're talking about the Potter home, the Potter land, and the intent of Fred in his will that it be used as a community center playground for the community. With an asterisk that said if you decide that doesn't work for you, you can sell it. He did say that. Some of the places called out, some of the beneficiaries of Fred's will included, of course, as we just described, and this little headline tells us, Fairport quickly went out with contracts to develop the building as a community center, also gave money to the fire department, gave money to the Congregational Church in memory of his mom, and the Methodist Church, and this very building here, the Fairport Public Library. His estate, I've listed some of the areas that money went to. I just talked about some of them, the village, the library, the fire department, the churches. The cemeteries, Mount Pleasant Cemetery and Greenvale Cemetery, each received some funding. I mentioned William Beaton. He was that gentleman driving that car, his father's chauffeur and then Fred's chauffeur. He received $14,000, including $3,000 for each of his children. Earl Jacobs, didn't talk much about Earl Jacobs. Earl replaced William Beaton. Earl was significantly younger than Fred, and Earl became Fred's constant companion and chauffeur and traveler. He drove for him, but he went on so many trips with Fred. Earl was left $25,000 in the will in 1943. By the way, Earl was married, and his wife lived in Penfield, on Old Penfield Road, right next door to Gentle's Farm Market. House is still there today. But he lived with and supported Fred for some years. Supported emotionally, working, as probably a best friend. A cousin in Missouri got $2,000. A friend in Pennsylvania. Way down the list, Gladys Wachner, nurse, $1,000. Finally, the remaining balance, whatever that was, and I don't know if that balance was $10,000 or $200,000. We've never been told, was split equally between 6 cousins. It seems like it could be a lot of money. These numbers only lead up to $114,000 plus the value of the property. In those days, they would say that the estate exceeded $250,000, but they wouldn't tell you how much, by how much it exceeded. Here's a picture of the house back in that era. Did you know it was painted? Beautiful place, as it was changed in the late 1890s. Here's a comparison of one of its early painted photos. This is from about 1908, and what it looks like more today. Of course, shortly after Fred's death, 1945, the memorial to soldiers was put in place there and has been ever since. Was rebuilt several years ago when it desperately needed it to be rebuilt. A collection of scouts and others that were helping fund the reconstruction of the memorial. And here is the property. I did this slide in 2010 with the designation of the Potter property as a local Fairport landmark. And at that time, called out for special designation was the house, the carriage house or barn, the enormous, beautiful beech tree, the outhouse, which was moved there from East Church Street, and the overall property, all part of the local designation of the Potter property, which does provide for, particularly on the exterior of the house, some protections in the event of future development or changes. It's not just a slam dunk that you can make changes that you want to do. It's a rigorous process. These are the gravestones of people that I've talked about today. Alfred, Huldah, his wife, the 3 kids, Alice, Bertha, and Fred. And the most notable thing I guess I can say about this, is the contrast, these modest stones in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Fairport as compared to the grandfather Henry's stone. I kind of like it when people have money and they don't have to flaunt it, right? Here's a sketch by, oddly, a man named Potter, who was no relation. This is the house as sketched by him, Maurice Potter, East Rochester artist that did a lot of work in Fairport. And here is a little chart I thought I'd show you. Many of us think about this house as the home of Fred Potter. Well, the house was built in the 1850s. First owner, Spencer Philbrick, then Davis C. Bloomfield. We're going from the 1850s to today. These bars indicate how long they owned the house. Alfred and Huldah owned it from about 1872 to the mid-1890s. Huldah then on her own, after her husband passed away, right up until her death. Then Bertha and her husband, Fred's sister, they took ownership and Fred lived with them. It was not until about 1935 that Fred took possession of that house. Fred only owned that house for 8 years. The Potter family owned it for a very long period of time. But Fred really owned that house, the only house he ever owned in his life, for a very short period of time. We know how quickly 8 years goes by. Today, the house, the property, and the entire northern end of Potter Place is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's a treasured part of our community, and the Potter family are an important part of it. And I hope you know a little bit more about it than you did before. And it was an excruciatingly difficult story to tell. Thank you for sticking with me.